Welcome to Principles of International Relations. Hello, and welcome to this week's class in Introduction to International Relations. The topic of today's class is global justice and human rights. And obviously this is a really important topic, but also the recent developments are kind of interesting on this, where we see that human rights violations especially have been increasing in the last decade. And so I want to see two different factors. On the one hand, I want to look at the empirical kind of evaluation of human rights and global justice and see how the development is in the medium to long term. But at the other hand, I also want to connect it with theoretical concepts, and especially the idea of transfusion of norms into more general understanding. So the combination between the empirical evaluation of human rights and global justice with the theoretical concepts will be the primary focus of this class. So I hope you will enjoy it. Please stay tuned, and I will go right into the slides. Thank you. All right, everybody, welcome back. Let me first kind of provide you with an outline what I would like to talk about today. And in this way, I want to kind of give you an overview over the human rights movement, and then really right into it, kind of take one point out, which I think is quite important in understanding, and that is the language of human rights. The way of how language has changed and how language has changed perceptions on human rights and human rights abuses as well. Afterwards, I will kind of give you a brief overview over certain organizations and structures which help to support human rights on a global scale. They are mostly non-governmental organizations, but also some other ones as well. And then I would want to kind of combine these kind of two things, the language and the organizations, to see how diffusion of human rights norms is expected to work and what it actually means. In a way, the following from this, I would like to the domestic practice of norm diffusion, which might help us being more optimistic about that human rights ideas become mainstream and become possibly used by all global actors in the midterm future. So this case is quite interesting, and it looks at Israel as a country and its torture litigation. And it is interesting because the change of the perception of norms within Israel has actually kind of led to a change in the legislature, in the interpretation of legislation within the courts, and that kind of led at a later stage then to a reduction of human rights violations within Israel. Of course, we have to kind of see that Israel is a democratic country, and therefore we have independent courts which can kind of interpret legislation independently. But at the same time, I think what it shows neatly is how different perceptions lead to different interpretations of legislation, and this leads to different practices at the end. And it is not only limited to democratic states, but could also be an effect in authoritarian states as well. However, at the end, of this lecture, I will provide you with a more somber outline of human rights and global justice empirical observations. And what we find there is that actually, in reality, human rights don't become more widespread in the last 20 to 30 years. I will kind of provide you with, of course, with a more nuanced kind of outlook, but it's much more somber, and we have to see whether we can really kind of see this norm diffusion, which a lot of human rights activists hope, how human rights will become more generally accepted, whether this works or not. Okay, but before we start, I want you to kind of think about yourself, about a specific a citation I have from Henry Morgenthau, who was the US ambassador to Turkey in 1915. And what he kind of describes here is the Turkish genocide on the Armenian minority population. And he kind of describes the conflictual situation he feels himself being a witness of this situation, and how he should react. I will read it out, and then I want you to think about. I will tell you more about it just in a minute. So, it is difficult to restrain myself from doing something to stop these attempts to exterminate a race. But I realize I'm here as an ambassador and must abide by the principles of non-interference with the internal affairs of other countries. So what we do see here is a conflictual behavior between different norms. On the one hand, the US ambassador, Henry Morgenthau, sees that something that a genocide is actually taking place, and that this is unjust behavior of the Turkish government at the time. And at the other hand, he also feels that he's bound by the norm of non-interference, so the sovereignty of a nation state to make its own decisions. And this kind of duality of different norms, at the one hand, kind of seeing situations which are violating human rights, violating individual rights, kind of going against norms of global justice, are the one aspect. And the other aspect of it is the norm of non-interference in domestic affairs of other countries. And that's something which has been kind of the reason why I show you this kind of citation, because it kind of, this duality has existed already more than 100 years ago in the thoughts of Henry Morgenthau. But this is something which is commonly discussed in current affairs as well. So, for example, if we see international other governments or non-governmental organization, intergovernmental organizations speaking out against human rights violations of the Chinese government with its Uyghur minority, or another example with how the Chinese government is acting towards the democratic movement in Hong Kong. If we have outspoken comments from political leaders, the most standard answer from the Chinese government is that these are domestic affairs, and that there should be a non-interference of external actors in domestic affairs. So basically, to say it in a more kind of colloquial style, countries say that it's none of the business of other countries. I just used these kind of the situation of a Uyghur in Hong Kong as an example. Of course, this is persistent in many situations. We could think about the Rohingya issue in Myanmar, just to name another one. But there are many situations where we have this kind of dilemma between non-interference from external actors and kind of violations of human rights on the domestic level. And my question here is now, what would be a consequence? What would be a good action in these situations? Should external actors interfere, or should there be a domestic? The sovereignty should overrule any kind of concerns from external actors. To kind of further this discussion a little bit more, you could also think about certain very extreme cases. One which is more recent, that is the genocide in Rwanda, where millions of people have been killed. But maybe the worst situation where this was actually an issue and has been heavily discussed could be seen around the Holocaust in Germany, where in an industrial style, Germany killed its Nazi Germany killed its Jewish population. And one of the biggest criticism about the alliance forces has been that they did not interfere earlier to stop this mass murder of the Jewish population within Germany during the Nazi dictatorship and of course the Second World War. So these are of course very extreme cases. We have much less extreme cases as well, as I mentioned before, but also many other cases. So I would like you to take a pause here of this video. Think about these different kind of norms and what you think is the best kind of course of action within this dilemma situation. Okay, just take a break for 10 minutes now and come back to this place again. You can write your answers on our Padlet site. I'm very interested to see what you have to say about that. Okay, I will go back. I will continue with the lecture. So I hope you paused and I wrote down these issues, and we can kind of use this for our discussion in class. But I will continue with the lecture now. One of the biggest kind of struggles which we have from the human rights movement is actually to kind of create a common understanding what human rights are, why they are important, and what they include. There is a kind of a big discussion going on along these ideas of human rights, whether they are actually kind of universal, meaning that they are kind of true for every human in every part of the world, or whether they are specific Western values which have been kind of created based on Western ideas about humans and human behavior, and therefore should be seen as a form of domination of Western values over other, like Asian or other values in the world. I leave this kind of discussion out. We can kind of think about this in class as well. But one of the kind of the key issues is that to understand this very abstract form or idea of human rights. And what human rights activists kind of did with this is that we need to kind of find a language which includes these situations, these scenarios, and kind of defines human rights in practical terms. So when do we have a violation of human rights? What is included in this? Is it about your individual freedom? Is it about your individual your right not to be harmed? Is it about freedom of expression? Is it about identity and kind of being able to present who you are? What about sexual orientation? Is it something which has to do with your human rights, etc., etc.? So we need to kind of define what the scope of it is. And very often, and one of the things human rights activists see here is that the language is very important. So the first kind of part is to kind of find a common language about what human rights are and what violations are. The second part is that this language is accepted and kind of applied on real cases in the world. So kind of understand, not just kind of understanding the topic, but also the willingness to act on it. One interesting part, that's maybe just a side story, but one interesting part is that we actually find, if we kind of observe the term of human rights and human rights violation, we find that within the media, it is much more frequently used nowadays. It has kind of increased dramatically. But something which is, I think, is even more interesting is that the language of human rights and human rights violation have been rejected by many, mostly authoritarian regimes. But at the same time, in situations where it has been kind of seen as politically beneficial, these kind of arguments have been used as well. So just to give you one example, the recent the recent imprisonment in Canada of the daughter of the Huawei founder, who has been accused of breaking laws about or circumventing laws on sanctions of Iran, and there is a kind of a process whether she should be extradited to the U.S. and kind of prosecuted there or not. But this situation has been seen as political by the Chinese government rather than kind of a criminal justice case. And the Chinese government has argued along the lines of human rights violations of one of her citizens in this situation, saying that it is violating the Huawei daughter's human rights to be kept in Canada in this case. So this is quite interesting because this case shows that while China generally doesn't really believe in the universality of human rights, it argues in this specific case about violations of human rights, and that can be seen as one aspect that actually the language of human rights is becoming more generally used and widely used, even by countries and political regimes which are generally opposed to the universality of human rights. Well, in a way, if we kind of think about this from a conceptual perspective, we can say that human rights language has to replace other forms of languages, and very often this is kind of seen as a social change. For example, we have languages of modernization and dependency theory, Marxism, etc., are all kind of creating their universal language about fairness, about the benefit for society of specific kind of actions, and human rights language can replace some of these kind of forms of language in order to kind of shed light on specific problems which are kind of provided to the individual by actions of governments or the society. Of course, we could kind of interpret, use many cases of human rights violations, and I would like you to point you towards the annual report of Amnesty International, which is actually meticulously reporting empirically individual cases of human rights violations by governments across the globe. And one thing which is maybe surprising is that Amnesty International is recording many cases of human rights violations in countries which are generally perceived as following the ideas of human rights. So these kind of violations maybe prevalent in specific political regimes, specific regions, as well as specific specific countries and specific kind of political crisis situations, but they are not kind of limited to these situations. We do find them in many different situations as well. And here the scope is really important again. So some things which might be generally not understood as human rights violations are taken up in these descriptions as well. So it's a very interesting and important read, and I would kind of like you to have a look at this as well. So if we kind of think about organizations which deal with human rights and which kind of try to protect them, we have a very large group of activists, non-governmental organizations, but also governmental organizations. So what I have here is a list of actors which are predominantly which are very active, but on a global level. And something which is really important about these organizations as well is that their aim is to protect human rights, protect humans and kind of highlight human rights violations. But at the same time, they are not politically affiliated. So we should distinguish between these organizations and their observations of human rights violations and maybe political aims and geopolitical kind of movements which political actors use. So very frequently in political or in situations of conflict, human rights violations are used as a reason for action by specific countries, or kind of a point of pressure for other actors. But these organizations, that is not the aim of these organizations. These organizations are there to observe, highlight human rights violations, and by doing so, hoping to help the individuals and the societies at large to minimize these violations. Of course, I mentioned already Amnesty International as one of the biggest organizations on the global scale, but Human Rights Watch, International Commission of Justice, International Federation of Human Rights, also very important organizations in this field. The International Committee of the Red Cross has a broader spectrum than only human rights, but it is also kind of dealing specifically with human rights. There are also other organizations which are maybe important to name, for example, Doctors Sans Frontières or Doctors Without Borders, which are kind of not necessarily kind of dealing alone with the issue of human rights, but very often in their in their cause to protect the individual safety are dealing with issues of human rights violations. In a way, the field of human rights activists and human rights organizations is very complex, and I want to give you some kind of different acronyms here to kind of find your way around these organizations. So we do have non-governmental organizations like Amnesty International, which I mentioned before, which are basically groups of interested citizens which kind of try to kind of follow the organization, kind of create an organizational structure, and within this organizational structure follow these general goals. Within the non-governmental organizations, there are, of course, different groups as well, some which specifically focus on domestic issues and kind of maybe more regional and local problems. And then there are international organizations like Amnesty International and others, which try to look at this from a global perspective. These kind of non-governmental organizations are should be kind of distinguished from intergovernmental organizations. So intergovernmental organizations are like maybe organizations like under the umbrella of the United Nations. So they are not created by individual people, but rather kind of by states. And with this, they have different functions. On the one hand, they represent maybe the international community of nation states. And so they have limited capacity in acting because very often the violators of this of the human rights are part of this international community. On the other hand, they are of course sorry about that. The mandate is from the nation states or the community of the nation state, and therefore, in specific cases, they have much higher authority than non-governmental organizations, which normally can only observe. But intergovernmental organizations, very often, if they do have a mandate, can act as well. We have many other organizations which I don't want to go into, which is predominantly based on their specific status within the non-governmental organizations community. So they're quasi non-governmental organizations or donor organized organizations. Very often their independence is less strictly observed than in non-governmental organizations. So they might have a political aim as well, or kind of based on a kind of a religious observation, etc. Then there are some of these organizations are government regulated, others not. Some come from business or industry backgrounds, then there are kind of donor organized organizations as well. The reason why these kind of distinctions are made is very often to see the purpose of these organizations. So not all are necessarily independently created for protecting human rights, but maybe to also further certain political or economic agendas. And in these circumstances, of course, their information might be less, more biased than from organizations which don't have these kind of background. To kind of give you a little bit an overview of the recent human rights activities, I have a graph here which is only from 1981 to 2000.
it's not, of course, this is relatively old information, but I don't think that we see much change, even if we kind of develop it, kind of look at this further. What we do see is that the members, the activities worldwide is like, we do see that the number of organizations have been relatively constant over this time. We also see that there has been an increased talk about human rights in journalistic articles. In this way, this is the observation about The Economist. In the Newsweek, which is another political journal, we see the same kind of trend, but more fluctuation. So in 1997, the drop has been more dramatic than, and then the increase afterwards than in The Economist. So we do see fluctuation, but generally kind of a slight increase in the number of articles which involve human rights issues. Maybe one of the interesting aspects here is that the increase of trade agreements which have an impact on human rights. It is true that nowadays more and more trade deals are not only focusing on economic cooperation, but also incorporate some kind of social aims as well as concerns over human rights. And these, an advantage of this is that they kind of link together different topics which are of concern, but at the same time might not be necessarily related. And in this way, countries can actually exercise more pressure on other countries to change their human rights practices if they think this is important, and therefore have the opportunity to influence the individual countries' practices more than only by demanding change without having any kind of reciprocity actions in this. Something which has been recently criticized in this way is that, for example, the general investment agreement between the European Union and China does include very limited amount of these human rights safeguards. Not all observers agree that this is a fair description of it, but in a way it might reflect also the power structure in these kind of negotiations. So if the countries which want to increase human rights or decrease human rights violations are in a more powerful position, then then they can of course dictate the course of action. But if this is not the case, but rather the authoritarian regime is in a very powerful position, then their scope is limited, and that's maybe what we see in this observation of the China EU trade deal at the moment. What you see here in this specific slide is actually something a little bit different. And you see the human rights records by regions, and see human rights violation records by regions. And what we do find is that in the same period of time, there has been a little bit of fluctuation, but generally speaking, the violations have been relatively stable across the different regions and not necessarily decreased a lot. In the case of Asia, we actually see that there has been a slight increase of human rights violations. We do see a decline in Eastern Europe around 89, when the end of the Cold War, and the move towards democratic states has taken place. But except that, there's not much change happening there. And so the question is how whether we really kind of see this kind of, whether there is a trend towards respecting human rights from a global perspective or not. Let me tell you a little bit about how human rights activists and several scholars think about how human rights norms will kind of change the world. And one of the big problems here is that with the lack of international organizations, which can really kind of force countries to act in a certain way, human rights are relatively weak, and human rights violations are relatively frequent. So the idea that how human rights norms diffusion is taking place is that countries kind of which are maybe more liberal and more supportive of human rights are championing these kind of rights and kind of developing standards which are then used by domestic actors in order to pressure their own governments. So kind of showing specific rights and kind of showing violations of protections against violations of human rights in certain parts of the world might have an impact on creating new norms in different countries. So if people, for example, observe in authoritarian regimes that in more liberal regimes, people are provided with certain rights, the idea here is that this might lead to an increase of the rights of the individuals in these authoritarian regimes as well. So there's an idea about a so-called spiral effect. So step by step, actually, human rights are kind of diffused from one area to another, but also that they're cumulative and that they become like even if the beginning steps are relatively small, that over time they will be increased, and this kind of spiral process would lead to a situation where most countries are supportive of human rights and guarantee them for their citizens. To show you a little bit how this could happen, we have how treaties can influence, for example, domestic politics. I want to kind of show you the case of Israel. And one of the interesting parts here is that a lot of international treaties on human rights are non-enforceable. So countries can sign them, but don't necessarily need to abide to them. So you might ask, like, if they don't want to abide to a certain international a treaty, why would they say sign it? And so the idea here is that maybe this again could be connected with other issues like economic benefit, but also it could kind of be due to the goodwill, not the goodwill, due to the desire of a regime or a political leader to be internationally accepted. And that is something which at a later stage we will discuss a little bit, that can actually be kind of problematic in this way as well. But the important part here is that many of these kind of treaties are voluntary and non-enforceable. So countries can actually kind of join them, but even if they violate it afterwards, they will not have any kind of negative consequences from it. But the idea is that if they sign it, then at a later stage, actually maybe domestic actors will be able to kind of use them in their to put pressure on governments to kind of abide by these kind of rules. So what we see here is what we see here is the case of Israel. And so this is that Israel signed in 1991 the so-called CAT, which is a treaty against torture. And again, this is a non-enforceable voluntary treaty, which says that doesn't specify any punishments for actors who are violating the treaty. But what we can find here is actually the cases which are filed against acts of torture. And we do have the amount of also the amount of cases of torture which have been declined by courts. So in the beginning, what we do have before 1991, actually since 1990, since this has been in discussion, there have been an increase of cases which have been filed, but none of them has actually been decided. What that means is basically these cases were not accepted or were not seen as valid to have like a case, a decision. After the signing of Israel of the international treaty, we have a little bit of a period where not much is happening. But then at a later stage, what we do find is that there is a increased number of cases filed, but also an increased number of cases decided. Until the case of 1999, which was a landmark ruling where actually the Supreme Court of Israel said that no cases torture could be justified. And what we have afterwards is that the cases filed are kind of steeply declining, and the cases decided as well. And the reason for this is that lots of procedures have been changed within Israel, and torture actually kind of was substantially reduced after this kind of landmark ruling. So what we can find, why is this kind of useful? Well, we can see here that it's not necessarily the signing of Israel of the treaty which is important, but the treaty kind of started a domestic process, which then kind of changed the perception on the domestic level about the situation of torture, which again in reverse led to an increased amount of cases filed to courts, and then eventually of a decision by the Supreme Court to outlaw any form of torture, which then settled the issue again and made it illegal, and therefore led to reduction of cases of torture within Israel. So it's not necessarily immediately the treaty signing, but rather the domestic process which followed afterwards. To support domestic actors in this way, there have been internationally, the Helsinki principles have been established. And these kind of principles are guidelines in order to kind of see if human rights violations have taken place. Why are these kind of principles important? Again, because they kind of are part of this change of the language, as I mentioned beforehand. And so they kind of are providing comprehensive understanding about what human rights violations are and how to deal with them specifically. And in return, these kind of principles or norms led to the possibility for domestic actors, again, to challenge the practice of their governments. So to see some examples, we could look at the case of Poland and Czech Republic at the end of the Cold War, where we have seen that both governments have frequently violated human rights and human rights practices, but they have been, the dissident groups could kind of gain authority by claiming these human rights violations based on the Helsinki principles. And these kind of use of the Helsinki norms strengthened the position of the dissident groups. So this was very true for the Solidarność group in Poland. It just kind of increased the legitimacy of the cause of action, which made it in return harder for the government to suppress it. And so what we do see here is that again, human rights and existence of human rights violations does not necessarily have a direct effect on the strength of a political regime, but the continuation of violation gives opposition groups and dissident groups legitimacy and strength that their actions of the governments are unjust. And so in this way, they help to support groups in order to kind of reduce human rights violations within the country. And we do know that in Poland and the Czech Republic, Czech Republic, this has been very successful and led actually to was a really integral part of the end of the Cold War in itself. However, this is maybe the more individual kind of perspective of specific countries and how, from a theoretical perspective, these mechanisms can happen. However, if you look at this from a statistical perspective in a large scale across the globe, the results are much more skeptical, which we have to see. And what we can see here is that actually, many governments sign up to international norms, but much fewer are implementing them. And what we do see specifically is that especially governments which are most likely to abuse their citizens might sign the norms, but are not are sometimes even more likely to violate these norms after signing the treaty. And one of the aspects which how this is often kind of seen is that signing a treaty gives government legitimacy, and they could always kind of point to it and saying like, well, we for example in the CAT treaty, the torture treaty, they could argue that, well, we signed this treaty, so we are against torture, but in reality actually continue to torture or maybe increase their torture. One effort which is kind of suggested by many organizations is this idea of naming and shaming. And one of the most important player again here is Amnesty International. Why? Because it kind of documents individual cases and documents them to a very kind of high level of detail, and therefore is in a position of being able to name and shame violators much better than others. But this is all relying on the support of these organizations and the access to information, which can be really difficult for them as well. This mechanism, which I kind of mentioned before, is actually can be seen quite well in the ratification about the Convention Against Torture, the CAT treaty, as I mentioned before. Since 1985 to 2002, we see a continuous increase of countries which have been ratifying this treaty. At the same time, what we also see is that actual torture data is not or only slightly decreasing in the same period of time. And so we don't have a very strong effect by this treaty and the fact that increased amount of countries have actually signed the treaty. So we could say like this kind of leads the way of the critics saying that these kind of treaties are toothless and not very valuable. But at the same time, human rights, some human rights scholars, and I'll show you this at the later stage, are arguing that this is all part of this kind of spiral effect where there is a norm transfusion, and therefore it is still important to actually have these treaties and keep pushing for signing as many countries as possible. So I will kind of show you some of the interpretations of different kind of scholars which are important in this field. And the first one is Tsutsui and Hafner-Burton, and they're kind of really important analysis: justice lost, the failure of international human rights laws to matter. They are being very critical of this and are kind of looking at it from a very critical perspective. So what they are saying is, so no matter how we measure repression of personal integrity rights, repressive states that allow murder, torture, kidnapping, and other cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatments and punishments of people just as commonly belong to the CCPR and the CAT, outlawing these behaviors as governments that protect human rights reasonably well. So CCPR and CAT are two treaties to protect human rights, as I mentioned before. But what Hafner-Burton and Tsutsui's summary here is that actually they don't matter much. These treaties don't matter much because countries are more or less equally likely to violate these treaties, whether they sign them or not. And so this is one of the interpretations, that these treaties are not important or maybe even irrelevant. A different position has Beth Simmons, and in her work for Mobilizing for Human Rights, which she wrote in 2009. And Beth Simmons argues, especially along the lines that human rights treaty commitments make differences in countries, especially if they undergo democratic reforms anyway. So in this way, it is really important because it kind of sets the norms for domestic legislation or even litigation. So by focusing on many Latin American countries and Eastern European countries, she concludes that this has been these human rights treaties have been very substantial norms which are provided guidelines for the countries to develop their domestic legislation as well. And she concluded in her book that the change has been gradual, but encouragingly cumulative. So the idea here is that she says, like, it's going by small steps, but it is increasing over time. And she kind of concludes that these treaties are important and playing an important part, maybe not an immediate important part, but over time become important. But in a way, what she's not saying, and what is really important, is that Hafner-Burton and Tsutsui are actually measuring something a little bit different, and that is that that human rights treaties only work in political regimes where there is some domestic resonance already. So where there is a change of ideas and where domestic legislation has an impact, and where citizens have an input on domestic legislation. What we do have to see is that many authoritarian systems, domestic actors don't necessarily have a strong impact on the legislation, and therefore human rights violations or these treaties might not make have a big impact on human rights violations. So in a way, what we can take from a conclusion here is that countries which think about changing their human rights record might actually be supported by these kind of treaties. But the worst offenders who are unwilling to change are not affected by it. And there are some other studies which we don't discuss here, might even become worse. So this is basically what I had in our discussion from today for human rights and global justice. I think this is a really important topic, and it will kind of continue to develop further. If you are interested in this topic, I'm happy to discuss it in class, but also I'm happy to discuss any kind of capstone thesis ideas you have along these lines, because I think much more research needs to be done. And it is a very vibrant field where lots of research is currently underway. So if this is the case, please get in touch with me and we can discuss it one-on-one. However, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class. Until then, take care and bye-bye.